So, we've analysed the story, the facts and significance. So now, let's look at the evidence.
Okay, now that we have analysed the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, we have assessed the Bible facts and their significance. Let us now look at some of the evidence in support of these facts. To examine this evidence, we must first take a particular focus upon the story's importance and significance to Africa. However, keeping in mind at all times the Bible's story and the facts. This evidence also provides us with an insight into the unique heritage and the special connection and relationship of the continent of Africa and African people to Christianity from its very inception. So, come, now that we are ready, let us see what has all this got to do with African Christianity. Now let us examine and look again at question 1, why they fled to Egypt, the flight. Now, as we have seen, the Bible tells us that immediately after the wise men departed, that Herod ordered the massacre of all children under the age of 2, as an attempt to kill Christ before his mission even began. If successful, the world would not have known God's salvation. Although we must mourn the killing of the innocent, we must also celebrate and rejoice in the fact that the Christ was protected and found sanctuary in Africa, where neither Herod nor the great deceiver himself could bring him any harm. Here is a picture of Herod ordering the massacre of the innocent.
I would never give the power to appall him. Run, come, crucify the dread.
Now before we proceed, let me first set out this fundamental premise, that contrary to popular belief, Egypt is actually in Africa, as is the Sinai Peninsula. So let us zoom in into this northeastern corner of Africa. Now look at this map, and as you can see, here is Israel, and this is Egypt. But remember, this is also Egypt. So all of this area is Egypt. This is very important to note, as we will see as we proceed. Now, come let us look at question 2. When and how did they travel? The journey. Now it is important to know that the land today called Israel has since time immemorial had strong links with Africa and with Egypt in particular. This is corroborated not only in the Bible but also in history, by archaeology and through other modern sciences. Likewise, the exchange of goods, ideas, culture and even genetics is also certain. However, when people think of the relationship between Israel and Egypt, they often focus entirely on the exodus and flight out of Egypt, without considering the significance of the many flights made into Egypt by the patriarchs and even by Christ himself. Now, before we go any further, here's a refresher on some Bible geography and history. Here again is a close-up of the map of Israel and Egypt. Remember, here is the border which separates the two lands. Now, before we consider the possible route and journey of the Holy Family, come let us examine the heritage of some other recorded migrations in history by people from Israel to Egypt. Now, one of the earliest attested migrations of specific Israelites from Palestine to Egypt was that of the great father Abraham himself with his wife Sarah. Abraham traveled and migrated to Egypt around 2,000 years before Christ. However, his stay was short-lived and he returned to Palestine within 30 years. Although he left Egypt due to offending Pharaoh, he was still laden by Pharaoh with much cattle and treasure for his journey. Importantly, this generosity of Pharaoh became the very foundation upon which the family and therefore the nation of Israel was built. Then we have Joseph, who was to his misfortune sold into slavery by his brothers. But due to the grace of God, he found his way to Egypt and found favor with Pharaoh. He was therefore saved and protected and eventually became an influential man in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself, we are told. His influence was so great that he was able to invite his entire family, including his mother, his father and his wives, his 11 brothers, his sisters and other family members, an estimated 70 individuals in total, into Egypt, just a few years after his grandfather Abraham had left in about 1875 BC. A few important facts to note here is that Joseph was unrecognizable by his own brothers amidst the African Egyptians, and that he had married the high priest's daughter Asenath, and they had 2 sons. Now these 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were added to the 12 tribes of Israel by Jacob himself. Now we are told that after Joseph had passed away, the Israelites lost favor in Egypt, resulting in the infamous 400 years of bondage, until the birth of Moses in around 1580 BC. Ironically, like his ancestor over 3 centuries earlier, Moses was indistinguishable amidst the African Egyptian, as he was actually brought up in the house of Pharaoh, posing as his grandson. Moses spent the first 40 years of his life growing up in Egypt, and the next 40 years in Midian, Western Arabia, with his Ethiopian wife Zipporah. Aged 80, Moses returns to Egypt to lead the Israelite people into the Promised Land, the Exodus. By this time, however, the family of a mere 70 individuals that had entered Egypt 4 centuries earlier were now a population close to 3.5 million strong. Their intention was to leave Egypt on foot across land, but we are told were forced unexpectedly to turn towards the sea that God parted for them to enter safely out of the Egyptian Delta and Nile region into the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. It is here, shortly after the Exodus, that Moses goes up Mount Sinai, converses with God and receives the 10 Commandments. It is therefore also important to note here that Mount Sinai is also in Africa. However, in Moses' absence, the Israelites quickly lose faith and were punished by a ceaseless wandering in Egypt's wilderness for a further 40 years, before they finally entered the Promised Land, Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine. Now we can also be sure that migrations to and from Israel and Egypt continued over the centuries that followed, particularly when Israel was being attacked and conquered by foreign forces. Therefore, it is with this heritage that we find the Holy Family, with Christ himself, having to again turn to Egypt for sanctuary, as their many ancestors had done previously, beginning with Abraham 2,000 years earlier, who had made this exact same journey traveling along well-established ancient trade routes.